Well, thank you, Antonio, for your presentation. I'll continue with spatial design, creating a new urban tissue, and I think that kind of wraps up all that we've been talking about up to now. And what it really means is that we need to start thinking beyond the urban surface layer. So we have to kind of break away from this idea that we need to bring everything below the surface that we don't want at the surface, but rather to kind of look at the subsurface as a additional possibility, as an extension to what it is that we do at the surface in our cities. The use of the subsurface often comes forth from ridding the surface from urban blight and placing all those uses that do not require daylight below the surface. In this way, the urban surface layer was created, much as was proposed by early thinkers. And you can see one of the examples here that we have from a junction in Japan, where you can clearly actually see that urban surface layer. You can see all these utilities that have been placed below the surface, and you can also see what happens when one of those pipes carrying water, as was the case, breaks, develops a leak, and then kind of creates a huge sinkhole, which devours, as it were, the whole junction. And I think this is one of the downsides when it comes to the subsurface, that we also have to realize that all those activities that are going on below the surface, if we're not very careful, they can actually have a very detrimental effect on surface life. You can imagine the same happening, for example, in Glasgow. The city of Glasgow is built on top of a lot of mines below the city, and nobody dares think what would happen if some of those galleries inside those mines, which have been long abandoned, if they collapse, that could lead to sinkholes appearing as well. And this is a kind of cross section of below the city of London, and you can see here that how the use of the subsurface for specifically transport, but also for watering mains and the Thames Tideway Tunnel, but that the intensive use actually kind of leads to how all these various uses are being placed deeper and deeper, because of the actual way that they started using the subsurface quite close to the surface. You can see sewers at 4 meters. You can see cut and cover underground lines that are only 5 or 6 meters below the surface, as compared with the deepest crossrail barrettes, which would go down to well over 60 meters below the surface. So we're kind of, the way that people started using the subsurface kind of means that we have to go deeper and deeper, rather than saying, okay, we should reserve the top layer, for example, for transport. Because if you place all those transport links deeper and deeper, it basically means that we have to transport people over those distances as well. And here you can see an interesting drawing of the labyrinth, basically, of all these tubes and tunnels below Piccadilly in London. It's a labyrinth of transport tubes, which lies just below the layer of cables, pipes, and sewers, and it doesn't really leave a lot of space for further development. So we have to kind of steer away from the urban surface layer, and the first thing that we need to do is to consider that the subsurface does not serve the city. It is an integral part of the city. As we said earlier, it is what provides life to the city. We look at the subsurface for a lot of services as well. And as such, its development should aim at integrating this new tissue into the existing urban fabric. And we need to move away from this concept of the urban surface layer towards an underground urbanism. And there are various ways in which we can do this. Here you can see the design of the Beurstraverse, which is in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and it started with an underground line and station below the main shopping street running through Rotterdam. You can see it at the bottom of the screen in the center, the cross section of the metro tunnel. And people just didn't want to go into the metro station. It was like a typical design where you had to go down stairs to walk into the metro station. And then designers came up with the idea, can we actually build a second shopping street, a sunken shopping street at the -1 level, and at the same time create a whole new connection between the underground metro, the metro station, and the surrounding area. And this is another way of looking at it. You can actually see the glass canopy running from the bottom of your screen towards the top, and that is where the underground shopping street is. It goes under the main roadway running from left to right across your screen. And if we take an even better look at it here, you can clearly see how people go down the stairs and enjoy the additional shops that have been created. We have a shopping street at the -1 level. Also note those trees that have been placed there. I talked about the trees that were in the Yaodong, in the sunken atriums. Here you can see those trees planted there as well. There are water features there. And I think the main point about the way this has been designed is that it's been totally integrated into the urban fabric. People walk into the Beurs Travers and they can shop, they can go to the metro station, they can connect into other stores which have basically opened up their basements into this street. And it is something that can be used 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's totally independent of whether the metro runs or not, or whether the shops are open or not. You can still use it for leisure purposes if you want to. And for me, it's a very good example of how through the spatial design we can ensure that the subsurface actually is integrated and becomes a part of the urban fabric. So spatial design challenges our perception of the surface-subsurface interface, and it demonstrates that we can transcend this barrier to integrate underground urban tissue into the urban fabric. So let's see how we can move from these Yaodongs via the contemporary to future designs.
If we could confront people as they go through their daily lives, through this station, with new sensations and therefore new ideas, I think that we have managed to take our stations from a servicing role to one that produces things. So what we've done is to take the platforms, the intermediate platforms that you need in order to connect to the different lines or to connect to these spaces that we are lining around the station, and we've oversized them. And we've also connected them with slopes on which we have ramps, on which we have steps, on which we have greenery. So at any one time, you could be just moving through this space, but you could also just be lying down. You could also be sitting, watching somebody perform. So you can constantly shift between being a spectator or a performer. Also, this building that wraps around this open space, it is designed, or it can be designed, to really become an infrastructure to this space as a space of performance. We should try to densify around our stations, because it is where it would be encouraging people also to use a lot more public transport, because there will be more reason to go to the public transport places, because you have pleasure and work and convenience. If we can develop an urbanism that is dense, that is mixed use, there will be less need to travel for conveniences. And perhaps travel becomes more of a choice, and travel becomes perhaps more for pleasure rather than for work. That's how we've approached it.
So that was an interesting design. It was a competition that was actually done by the RATP, the Transport Authority of the City of Paris, and Farshid Mousavi explained to us their concept of how they basically they opened up the underground stations, much like the example I gave from the city of Rotterdam. And I think it's this opening up of the subsurface, which is very interesting. It's very much like, again, like the Audong concept, but it kind of shows what is lying below, and in doing so, there's a much better integration of these spaces below the surface with the surface. So Farshid Mousavi sees the future station as a form of urbanism that brings together density and mixed use. And she basically follows Jane Jacobs in her observations of what makes a street attractive. We have to consider that if we want people to enjoy cities, the streets need to be attractive. They need to be places where people really want to be, where they can meet other people. That is basic. In essence, a city is about people being able to meet each other and enjoy the city. And in her observations, Mousavi also follows the definition of Gécous, which is basically the group that was started by Utu Jian. And it gave to the underground urban complex, they said, a network of connections for underground or surface transportation lines, circulating a large public through commercial, administrative, public, private, and amusement installations. And I think that is the key definition that we need to focus on when we talk about urban underground space. This is really far away from the earlier concept of the urban surface layer, which we really need to let go. And if we really want to get an appreciation also from the general public of what the subsurface can offer, we really have to move a lot more towards what Farshid Mousavi was showing us. And the definition of Gécous assumes that in order for the various functions to exist side by side, a considerable degree of conceptual coherence must prevail, along with the maximum amount of constructive logic. So let's talk a little bit about privately owned public open underground spaces, because this is also, when it comes to spatial design, is something that we need to think about when we want to create a new urban tissue. It is more than just developing underground spaces. It requires public accessible spaces. It must be designed to allow this as contemporary spaces act as private spaces, even if they are publicly owned and operated. And this last sentence is maybe a bit confusing, but let me kind of demonstrate to you what I mean. Here you can see a contemporary or rather a more historic entrance to the Paris Metro, to the Metropolitan line. It's very classical, and it's a small staircase that leads you down into the underground. Again, this is a more contemporary example, Canary Wharf Station, which is really a lot larger. It kind of acts as a symbol in the surroundings for, look, here, this is where the station is. And the glass canopy, when you come out of the station, you're on the escalators and you look out through the glass canopy, you see the surrounding buildings of Canary Wharf, and it really is a delight to do so. But to all intents and purposes, the public domain is actually limited by this station. If you in this kind of schematic that we made, you can see the two underground lines, and you can see the station, and you can see the canopies on both sides of the station. But basically, on the outside is where the public domain is, where you can be 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If you want to go down, you have to pass through the barriers and you have to have a ticket. So in essence, even though it's a public service, it is a kind of privatized domain which lies below the surface, which is not open and available to everyone. And the same thing happens when we look at for example, when we talk about the underground city in Montreal or the path in Toronto, what we actually see is that these came about through basement developments below office buildings that were then connected by urban corridors, if you like, and that connected into the actual metro system of those cities. But again, the essence is that the domain below the surface is private. You cannot enter certain areas after the office buildings close. You cannot enter the system after the metro closes, and in reality, even in Montreal, the underground city plays a vital role for the city, because daytime temperatures during summer can go anywhere in excess of 40 degrees, and during winter to minus 40 degrees. So people like to be below the surface because it gives them shelter. It gives them another way of enjoying the city without having to feel the elements. But if you can't do that 24 hours a day or 7 days a week, if you're bound by the opening hours of office buildings, then again, it's a private domain. It's not part of public open space. And here is what I was talking about. Here you can see the Place des Jardins, Montreal, Canada. Here, the underground level, the ground level of the city is where those escalators lead. So you can see that there are these beautiful squares that have been created beneath buildings, and then you move off into the corridors to either the next building or to a metro station or whatever. But again, it is not accessible all the time. Now compare that with the example I gave earlier of the Beurstraverse, which here you can see again more schematically. You can see the staircases on both sides. You can see the department store I talked about, into which the access is provided, and the metro line and the station there. But the whole point about the Beurstraverse is that it's been designed in such a way that you can actually access that whenever you like. So rather than it being a private domain, it is a part of the public domain. Now, if you go to San Francisco, then San Francisco is a really high density city. I don't think anybody will deny that. But they actually have very kind of secret spaces that are called popos. They are privately owned, public, open spaces, and they can be on top of buildings. They can be inside buildings at the ground level. But basically what San Francisco in its ordinance says is that any building that is built must provide a certain public open space. So you can actually go through the hotel to this rooftop garden and just sit there and enjoy the city. And it's got nothing to do with the hotel. You don't have to be a guest of the hotel. It is essentially open to everyone. And I think that is the kind of idea that we should also have when we look at underground space development. We should look a lot more towards developing, even though they are private spaces, we should design them as if they are public spaces, because only in that way can we truly say that they are contributing to the city, that we are actually making the subsurface, that new tissue that we are creating below the surface. We are integrating that into the urban fabric. And one essential element of that are urban underground corridors. I already mentioned that when we were talking about Montreal. Here's an example of the South Kensington subway in London, in UK. It doesn't really look very spectacular, but it does provide an interesting corridor to move from one side of the street to the other side. But at the same time, it also kind of opens up into adjacent buildings, which I will, hopefully I still have a picture of that in a minute. But those urban corridors, in effect, it's about connecting the dots. Those corridors connecting underground basements or atriums lie at the core of the development of a new urban tissue below the surface. Because in absence of those corridors, all we are doing is creating underground incidents, as we call them in our book. You know, we are developing things below the surface, but they're just dots. They are there. You cannot access them unless you come from the surface, and to go somewhere else, you have to go back to the surface. And in connecting the dots through those corridors, we really start to develop the subsurface in an interesting way. And Pierre Bélanger identifies 4 dynamics which are related to corridor development: spatial legibility, access and mobility, flow and usage, and spatial control and surveillance. And we discussed those more in depth in our book. Yes, here's the other image I was looking for. So here you can actually see how that South Kensington subway has an entrance to the Victoria and Albert Museum. And it's this entrance which makes the corridor interesting as well. So basically the corridor provides a surface. If it didn't have this opening, it might actually be quite a blunt corridor. But because it has this opening, there's a totally new dynamic that comes into play, and also the entrance is made attractive, which then again leads to a better enjoyment, if you like, of the usage of that corridor, even though you might not even want to enter the Victoria and Albert Museum. But just this one opening kind of enhances the whole urban corridor, and that's a very essential design element that we need to consider. So planning and design form the basis for the development of a new urban underground tissue. Leaving the development unchecked and subject to the whims of private developers and owners can in the long term only lead to a less desirable result. And this is a quote from Pierre Bélanger, who actually studied the development of the path in Toronto, and he wrote quite a famous article about this, which was published in Tunneling and Underground Spaces magazine, or Technology, I think it's called, TUST. And I think this is what we really at the core lies at our argument why we need to work together with the urban planners. You cannot just leave it up to private developers and owners to develop the subsurface in their way, just create all these iceberg mansions or basements below buildings, or even leave that unchecked and leave it to their whims. I think that will only lead to something that is what we really don't want to see. So in summary, promoting the subsurface as space for those objects that cause urban blight inevitably leads to the creation of an urban surface layer. And if there's one takeaway I hope you get from this training, is that we need to stop using this as an argument why we should be using the subsurface. It is not just about placing things below the surface that we don't want to see at the surface, because that, if we do that, we are basically just contributing to creating that urban surface layer. But when we really want to create underground spaces, they need to demonstrate a relationship with the surface and with underground space, with other underground spaces. And we can do that by looking at the way that we transition the interface that is there between the surface and the subsurface. If we do that through narrow staircases, then nobody's going to see that relationship. It is purely functional. If we open up those spaces, like the example that Musavi gave of their idea about the metro station of the future, if we open it up really in a grand scheme, even Canary Wharf, what they've done there, then there is this demonstration of that relationship between surface and subsurface. And the corridors play a vital role in that as well, because it's only those corridors that can actually complete, if you like, or create that new tissue. But the development of those corridors is governed by specific dynamics, and we really need to take that into account as well. Oops, sorry. Planning and design of urban underground spaces is required to prevent a self-replicating network coming into existence that is privately owned and operated. And this is essentially what happened in the two examples I gave from Canada. I can remember visiting Montreal, the underground city, with Antonia at one time. And I kind of asked quite an innocent question. And I said, well, if somebody has an accident below the surface in the corridor or in one of these squares, who's actually responsible for that, for getting help for that person? Is that seen as something that is part of the owner of the building above? Does he have to organize something, or does he have to have his own people look after the person or is it the same as when somebody goes down in the street, or how do the emergency services find this person? And actually it went pretty quiet. Nobody actually had an answer to this question. So you can see that these self-replicating networks that are privately owned and operated, the questions that you would ask at the surface when it comes to public spaces, those are not asked below the surface when they're privately owned and operated. And we really need to start avoiding that. So public spaces are as vital to underground development as they are to the city in general. And I think the public spaces that we can find in our cities are essential for that purpose of the city, that people can meet each other. But the big difference between the development at the surface and below the surface is that the public spaces at the surface come into existence through the buildings that we create and the street patterns that are there, and the spaces between those buildings are essentially the public spaces. If we go below the surface, we don't have any spaces between what we are creating. So we have to create the public space below the surface ourselves. And whether we do it as genuine public spaces, as in the example from Rotterdam, or whether we go the San Francisco way, where we have privately owned public open spaces, both will work in the same way. But we have to kind of appreciate that this needs to be part of creating that new tissue and be part of spatial design. So the vibrancy of underground spaces can only come about through sufficient accessibility and by providing the variety in uses that make plazas and indeed streets attractive places in which to exist. And I think this is really the core of what we should be thinking about when it comes to spatial design, and when we have this ambition to kind of extend the city into the subsurface. So I'm just going to read that one again because I really like it. The vibrancy of underground spaces can only come about through sufficient accessibility and by providing the variety in uses that make plazas and indeed streets attractive places in which to exist. And with that, I come to the end of this presentation, and I will quickly move on to our final slides because they contain some more information. But basically, we've come to the point where we can do question and answers, and then Antonia and I will wrap up.
Yes. Okay. As far as I can see here in the question and answer box, there are no further questions. No hay más consultas escritas por los participantes. There are no questions by the attendees. But I don't know if somebody can have some questions. Si alguien tiene alguna consulta y la puede escribir dentro del chat. Así la leemos.
Todo perfectamente claro.
Sí, yo diría que esta presentación, bueno, a través de la exposición de, bueno, ejemplos históricos, de las necesidades que se presentan hoy en día en las ciudades, de una guía de cómo abordarlo y de algunas recomendaciones muy específicas, generales pero específicas de diseño, yo creo que a todos nos abrió un poco la cabeza, porque los que no estamos en planeamiento urbano, por lo menos, no hemos tenido, por lo menos yo, acceso a este tipo de reflexiones, y sabemos, o lo que notamos hoy a través de este curso, cuán importante es incorporar el espacio urbano de una ciudad dentro de del diseño, hacerlo armónico y cumplir con todos los objetivos que realmente Antonia muy claramente describió que podría cubrir con muchos beneficios y muy eficientemente. Creo que es un puntapié para, como tú dijiste, Antonia, para poder mantener algún tipo de interacción con autoridades de la Ciudad de Buenos Aires. Me parece que podría ser muy interesante, porque no sé si existe, no sé, Oscar, no sé si estás presente y puedes participar, pero no sé si existe alguna reflexión sobre este tema. Yo sí sé que en algunos municipios de Buenos Aires o de Gran Buenos Aires se está trabajando con modelos BIM y se está trabajando de alguna manera en estructurar el espacio de la ciudad en superficie y de tenerlo de alguna manera bien identificado y hacer un planeamiento sobre la base de un modelo. Lo que no sé es hasta qué punto esto se está proyectando en el subsuelo, y sí creo que habría que ir en la dirección que lo están haciendo en ciudades como, bueno, Singapur sabemos que tiene desarrollos subterráneos hace mucho tiempo, pero Hong Kong, estas otras ciudades que ustedes mencionaron, y sin duda Buenos Aires es una ciudad que lo va a requerir y que cada vez más está también interviniendo el subsuelo, y eso tiene que efectivamente hacerse de una forma ordenada. Así que no sé, Oscar, si tienes algún comentario o alguien puede contribuir. Acá hay un colega de la ATES que es Daniel Capdevila. Bueno, pero él no está como panelista, no puede participar, que tiene mucho contacto con autoridades de la ciudad, y me parece que Antonia y Han podríamos planificar quizá alguna sesión de este tipo más específica.
Estamos entendiendo que estamos parte de un gran programa de 2 días de su conferencia sobre
Sí.
túneles y calidad de vida. Qué bueno que pudimos asistir en este programa.
Realmente, creo que fue muy interesante y a todos nos da mucho para pensar.
Mil gracias. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any further questions, or if you want to get in touch, or if you want to follow us. Han has here our key data in terms of how to connect with us on LinkedIn, and also on our respective websites of the Ethicus Committee and the book Think Deep. And as I said in the chat, you can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook with the name Underground Spaces.
Excellent. Well,
Just to finish with, again, with
yes.
our vision, the next level up is down. So we need to really look below our cities for the future, I think. And these are some useful references on this topic, recent publications, also the paper that Antonia mentioned about multidimensional planning, and other papers that might be of interest, also have relationships with sustainability thinking in terms of the use of underground space.
Yeah, and thanks a lot for your attention. Thanks for inviting us to speak here at this important conference, Martin. It's been a pleasure to...
It's been a pleasure for us, especially. Thank you.
Excellent.
To making your time available, and we enjoyed it very much.